Hey everybody. So we're going to look at chapter 26 here, Triumph of the Middle Class. In this chapter, we're going to look at the incredible U.S. economic boom after World War II, which makes us the most affluent nation on earth with the largest middle class of any society. We have lots of advantages. We're the only industrial country that was not devastated by the war. We weren't even really hurt by the war economically, industrially at all. This also is the sometimes referred to as the beginning, the Pax Americana, the idea of the American peace. Also, there was this pervasive idea by the 1950s that this was the American century. The 20th century was the American century, and all of that really ties into our economic dominance. The Pax Americana engines of economic growth. So, our massive defense spending, which we talked about in the last chapter, due to the Cold War, our concerns over communism, this really stimulated the economy. It really grew the economy. Um, the defense industry alone, after the war, employed 3.5 million people. This was just right at the end of the war. By 1970, 1/7 of the entire U.S., 1/7 of all workers in the U.S. were employed in the military-industrial complex in some capacity. This is not soldiers. These are not people in uniform. These are civilians working in some type of government job, some type of government position. These are not men or women in uniform. The United States was constantly ready for war, constantly ready to defend our values and to fight global communism. Constantly ready. Pentagon was created, which becomes the center of global warfare. And it is not just us. The Pentagon has affiliates and people working around the entire world from multiple countries. For the Western world, it becomes ground zero for global defense against communism and other threats. The Pentagon becomes a massive bureaucracy in Washington, employing thousands of people, eventually tens of thousands of people. This U.S. government defense spending, which ultimately employs or ultimately supports thousands of businesses and industries, employs millions of people. Government defense contracts across all aspects of society, all different industrial sectors, all these businesses. The Department of Defense, as we call it now, the Department of Defense results in uh, large shares of profits coming directly from the government as a result of defense contracts. Many private industries making all of their money, all of their profit off of selling their products or their services to the US government. It becomes the number one expenditure we talked in the last chapter. By the 1950s, the number one expenditure of the US government was defense spending. And all that money being spent is then going out to the economy and employing, again, by 1970, 1/7 of all Americans. This is probably the largest, oh, I think it is the largest sector of our entire economy. Seems pretty obvious. You've heard of Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon, and of course, thousands of others. This was the largest expenditure of the US government. Many years, 2/3 of our entire budget, 2/3 of the entire US budget was simply defense spending. Had this not stimulated the economy like it did, uh, it would have had catastrophic effects on our society. Because where all the money's going there, it's not going to any type of social services, any type of welfare programs, any type of other programs that stimulate or grow the economy. If it wasn't for the fact that it did employ so many people and put good money in their pockets and really creates a middle class in America, things would have been different. And of course, this enters us into the space and arms race throughout the Cold War. It was all about better bombs, better rockets, basically going further, going faster, and bigger booms. All to compete, not just with the Soviets, really to compete with the whole world. Although our probably the top of the list was the Soviets. All this money also goes in university research. Universities in the United States double in size. The numbers of university students and the actual size of university campuses double from the 1940s to the 1970s. Dozens of new universities built all across the U.S., dozens of universities expand campuses. As I said, the number of students double in college universities. And what you should know is many college universities, and maybe not really community colleges, most major universities, a great deal of their budget and expenditure is purely research. I graduated from San Diego State University, and I remember reading in the newspaper, the school newspaper one year, that they were receiving $2 billion in donations and research grants. So $2 billion for San Diego State just for the sole purpose of doing research. Many professors, universities, that's what they do. They either teach one single class or don't teach at all. So the university professors, they spend their whole time doing research, reading, writing, in labs. This becomes a major sector of our economy as well, a major sector of our educational institutions. In essence, private research and schools doing work for the government. Although it's not all private. Remember, a lot of schools are public. A lot of schools are partially funded by the government. This is one of those keys. Some do include universities as part of the military industrial complex. All kinds of new techs, new products, of course. What comes out of this? I mean, think about some of the things that come out of this. Think about that for a moment. Here's a research question, yeah, a good discussion question. Think about some of the products that have come out in our modern society. Think about things that we would never have had if it wasn't for these all this new money, this billions, hundreds of billions of dollars across the U.S. being poured into universities. All kinds of space age materials, space age products, all kinds of things we use today on a daily, everyday basis. All comes out of this space race and arms race. And again, it leaves a lot of money not being spent on other programs, social programs, for instance. But the economy continues to skyrocket because of all the money involved. America's GDP, our gross domestic product, that's the sum of all goods produced in the U.S. on an annual basis. Look how quickly it increases. 1945, it was 500. Let me say this differently. 1945, it was 215 billion. 1960, that's 15 years later, 500 billion. 1970, it's only 10 years later, 1 trillion. So it doubles in 15 years, then it doubles in 10 years. It would have probably doubled in 5 years. Projections put it doubling by like 75, 76, except we enter into a little depression in the 70s. We enter into a recession in the 70s. Had we not entered into that recession, it would have probably doubled again in only 5 to 7 years. We see a massive increase in personal incomes. Consumer spending jumps as well. Again, more money in people's pockets, they spend it. And it becomes our culture to spend our money, not save it. It becomes cultural to spend it and use it and buy all these new products, all these new cars and houses and all these new electronics and all this new stuff that comes out of this. People make more, spend more, and they're better off more. Generally speaking, standard of living increases, incomes increase, spending increases, and we reach the highest home ownership rate in American history. For the 1960s, 2/3, almost 70% of all families live in owned homes. That's the highest number we've ever had in our history since we've been, recording numbers. Modern history, I guess, would be the best way to put it. Rich poor gap decreases. First time since the 30s. Is it the 30s? It's been decades since we had a rich-poor gap decrease. The percentage of wealth owned by the wealthy decreases, and the percentage of wealth owned by regular Americans increases. It's very interesting. However, it should be noted most of this wealth, most of this increase, this affluence applies to the white middle class. Can't be ignored. It is the majority of Americans. Have no doubt. Minority people make up about 15% of the US at this time period. So it is the majority of Americans. But even a minority in an American country which has hundreds of millions of people, well, even a minority can be quite large. And by minority here, I'm referring to the poor, the really poor. Middle and upper class benefit the most from this. They really do. Which is the majority of Americans by this time period. Over 50% of people would be classified as middle class by the 1950s. Michael Harrington argues, what about everybody else? He really makes two arguments. What about everybody else? And the argument he makes is they're not doing well. And secondly, he argues the everybody else, the real numbers, are much larger than the government is letting on. In essence, he claims the government is lying or misinterpreting information or something like that. He argues some interesting statistics, which have not really been borne out by facts. He argues he's okay. I was going to say sociologist, I think, but don't quote me on that. He writes this in '62, The Other America. He claims that 1 out of 13 of all Americans live under $1,000 a year. That is what, about 8%, something like that, 7-8%. Live in abject poverty. Poverty is poor. Abject poverty is where you are so poor you really can't pay bills, you can't put food on the table. You make some type of money, but it's not money to even support yourself. It's not money to even provide the daily necessities of life. So abject poverty, just total poverty, a lot of homelessness, a lot of unemployment. He argues more than the government's claiming. And further, he even goes so far to say 1/3 of all Americans live in poverty. 33% of all Americans live in poverty. The government denies this because this gets lots of media attention. When this comes out, this book of his, This Other America, lots of media attention, and the government denies it strongly, showing all kinds of facts and figures showing none of this is real. Yes, there's people living in poverty, of course. There always will be. They're just the affluence will never reach a percentage of the population. And the government argues, but it's a very small number. It's just a few percent. We don't really know. If you trust the government numbers, 90% of all Americans are doing great. Not rich, but 90% of all Americans are doing fine. They're taking care of themselves. They're getting all their bills paid. They are providing for their families. Michael Harrington says it's about 66%, and 33% aren't. What's the truth? You don't really know. My personal opinion on it from the study I've done on it is it's probably splitting the middle. Probably 10, 15% of all Americans live in pretty bad conditions. A worse statistic is probably the percentage of white versus minority, especially white versus black. Even in the 1960s, if you're black, you're already 4 times more likely to live in poverty than a white person. That doesn't mean there's not a lot of poor whites too, but as a per capita basis, which is based on population, which means assuming blacks are 10% of the population, that would mean only 1 out of every, statistically, then only 1 out of every 10 people who's poor should be black, assuming it's an equal distribution. That isn't the case. Given those numbers I just gave you, it would imply that out of every 10 people, 4 out of those 10 people are black, minority. So it's even a worse number than this. It should be noted, as I'll cover a few times this chapter, this is the height of American prosperity in the 20th century, but it does primarily apply to whites. Now, do minority people enjoy benefits of this as well? They do. We see increased productivity, prosperity, and increased wealth generation in America across all spectrums, which does apply to minorities as well, and women, independent women, unmarried women. It applies to all groups. It just needs to be understood that it applies mostly to whites. Everybody benefits, but the greatest benefit is to white people. This is also a really interesting argument. The organization man. What's wrong with this picture? You might not see anything wrong with it. Hey, it's a bunch of guys getting off the train, apparently. They probably just commuted in from the suburb. We're going to mention suburbs. They got off the train, and they're all walking to work. But look at them. They all look the same. I mean, yeah, there's different colors and different materials, but generally speaking, they all look the same. Middle age, white man, hat, coat, suit and tie. There's what, 3 or 4 women maybe in the photo. This was an argument made by Dan Weiner here that this is what America was becoming. We were becoming brainwashed. We're all organization. It's organizational people. It's people aren't thinking for themselves. Everybody has this predetermined goal they're working towards, and this goal is of the middle class white family, which is problematic for several reasons. One, it doesn't often include women. If the women are included, they're usually the secretaries, while the men are the executives, or the men are the ones making the money. And further, there are no minority people in this photo. Now, this obviously is probably from a white suburb outside a city, a major city. That's another problem, though. As we'll discuss this chapter and the next chapter, segregation, discrimination, redlining, all the different types of stuff that kept minorities out of these newly affluent white middle class areas. They literally closed the doors. It's figuratively closed the doors to minorities, especially blacks. Final thing to think about in this photo is, can you surmise what Americans value as a result of this photo? Think about money. Think about the way they're dressed. Think about the transportation, where they're coming from, where they're going to. What is it we value in the 1950s and 60s? If you really look at this image of the organization men, and further think about what they're working for and where they're working towards and all of that. Not just today, but think about the future. Their families, their kids. Interesting. All right, a nation of consumers. Consumption was now part of being American. You made the money, use it. Spend it, buy goods. It was a social responsibility. In essence, you need to spend the money you make to put your neighbor to work. After all, if you don't buy a fridge, then they won't make a new fridge to replace it on the shelf, replace it on the store. And then when they, of course, have to replace it in the store, they have to get another one for the warehouse, which means they have to go make another one on the assembly line. Simply put, every time you buy one of these new products, you're putting someone to work. You're putting your neighbor to work because someone has to make a replacement for the one you just purchased off the shelf. The GI Bill is a big part of this. Everybody buys into this consumerism. All aspects of society, all socioeconomic levels buy into this. Military veterans are a big part of this. We have millions of veterans coming back at the end of the war. Most people in the military are let go when the war ends, as we do a massive drawdown. So we have millions of these. How many? Well, by 1950, about half of all college students are vets in the United States. About half of all college students served in the military. Millions and millions. We have millions of veterans serving. The universities, this is another reason universities expand. They literally have to double the number of seats they have because now they're all going to school in the GI Bill. The GI Bill, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, gives lots of them the ability to go to school for free, in essence, free education, to go get a job, to go get technical training, to get school training, to get a degree. Yeah, and millions take advantage of this. Universities expand to meet all this demand, and we do become the most highly educated population on Earth by the 1960s as a percentage of our population per capita. As you've probably been told growing up, the silver bullet to ending poverty and ending homelessness and hopelessness is education. Education equals money, and we do see earning power increase dramatically. It certainly does. This educated class had more money, more earning power, and of course, the more money you make, the more money you spend. Home ownership also becomes a norm in the U.S. As I said, almost 70% of all families live in owned homes. Home ownership becomes a norm. Million use the VA, the Veterans Affairs, which is that department of the government to deal with vets, and the GI Bill, of course. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act we've talked about is used to give free education, and they give home loans and job training and all kinds of things. Trade unions become the backbone of the American middle class. Most of these military-industrial complexes we're talking about, most of them had some type of unionization. These factories, these industries, and so unions become incredibly significant. Collective bargaining was embraced as well. Collective bargaining is a way that the employees get together and bargain for better benefits, better rights, better opportunities, better pay, retirement, insurance, holiday pay, all kinds of stuff. By the mid 50s, almost half of all workers in the US were unionized. This is often thought to be one of the most significant aspects of our middle class. If you joined an industrial trade union, you were immediately middle class in almost every case. It was just an instant stepping through a doorway into the middle class because it guaranteed you the social safety net. It guaranteed you insurance, benefits, retirement, vacations, and just so many benefits. Some of the biggest ones, United Auto Workers may have been one of the biggest unions in America, like for instance with General Motors, United Auto Workers, wages, pensions, insurance, as it says there. Or holiday pay, health insurance, often referred to as the social safety net. One of the reasons we are moving away from middle class in America today, the number of people in middle class continues to shrink in the United States. Unions continue to shrink. Today, less than a third of workers are unionized. We, teachers, we're unionized, and it is a significant aspect of our pay. It really is. We get better pay every year. We get benefits, and there's just so many benefits that come along with being in a union. This becomes the way to the middle class for millions and millions. Of course, what about the other side? Again, there's always the other side of the coin. What about all the people who don't get unions? Unionization for agricultural workers, almost non-existent. Minorities, very difficult to get in. A lot of unions specifically excluded minorities. Not all by any means. There's certainly a lot of places in America that you can get into a factory and be unionized regardless of color, regardless of race. But that's also other places where they specifically would exclude or make it challenging and more difficult to get in if you're a minority. Another issue, the service sector, which today is one of the largest employers in the U.S. I don't know what percentage it was back then, but it's one of the largest today. I'm sure it was quite big back then as well. The service sector, all the different services and hourly workers and servers and so many other aspects of our service sector. No, most service sectors are not included in unions. Also, women. Most of these union jobs were in factories, and factories were very exclusionary towards women. It wasn't that women weren't allowed to be employed there. There wasn't no laws were prohibiting it, but the companies often simply wouldn't employ women. They often wouldn't hire women. They'd hire them to be a secretary in the office, which often was not unionized, but they wouldn't hire them to be on the factory floor, which was unionized. Also, part-time workers. Minorities and women are much more likely to be part-time workers. Rarely are part-time workers part of a union. Even if the full-timers are unionized, often the part-time workers are kept separate and often aren't unionized. Lots of challenges, lots of people excluded. Still, it applies to the majority of Americans. But even 10% of Americans that it excludes, and I'm just throwing that number out there, it could be more than that. But even assuming 10%, we have over 200 million Americans. That is 20 million Americans excluded. It's freaking huge. That's crazy. Because I'm including everybody. You're saying, well, okay, only half those people are really workers because the other half are youth and young or elderly. It applies to everybody because if mom and dad aren't unionized, then that means the kids don't get the benefits of the union as well. So that includes children in there as well. So if the parents don't have union, don't have all the benefits, or they're simply not part of this whole new economy, they're a part-time worker, minority worker, service worker, agricultural worker. Well, that means their children are also being excluded, which that actually has trickle-down effect to the following generations. So, yeah. Consumerism becomes the new American norm for all social classes. Magazines, TV, they push the idea constantly that everyone needs new home appliances, new automobiles, everyone should own a home, everyone should have a new TV, a new fridge, and a new car in the driveway every couple years. Everyone should. There's even some research that's been done of that some companies specifically designed their products to fail after a few years. It's actually known as it's known as planned obsolescence, meaning companies actually design their product to fail after 3 to 4 years, forcing you to buy a new one or have it serviced or repaired. Yeah. These products drove the economy. Basically having the better job, purchasing the goods, which puts people to work making those goods again, which gives them a job and money, and it's just a cycle. Cycle just goes around. 25 million new homes in this period. 25 million new homes. The average family is about five. That's 125 on average. That's 125 million people moving into new homes between the 40s and the 60s. That's over half the entire population. That's like 60% of the population moving into a new home between the 40s and the 60s. That's a statistic that we've never achieved before or since anywhere near that. Of course, all these new products needed everything. All these new homes. So you buy a new home, it needs to have a new fridge, it needs to have a driveway, it needs to have a new fence, it needs to have a washing machine, it needs to have a television after 1947, new car in the driveway, all of this. We also see all kinds of new marketing strategies, generational strategies. There's a brand new generation in America called the teenager. Brand new thing. Previously, teenagers would have been either lumped into the child category or the adult category, depending on whether they were working or not. And a lot of teens did work, of course. Now we have a new separate category just of the teenager with new ideas, new styles, purchasing power. Previously, if you were a teenager and you had money, it's because you had a job, not because mommy and daddy gave it to you. You actually went out and got a job, earned your own money. And most likely, if you had that money, a significant chunk of it had actually be put back into your family to provide for the entire family. You didn't just keep that money. Now we have a whole new generation of millions of Americans that are literally just working to spend their money because teenagers don't have to pay rent, put food on the table because mom and dad can take care of that. So we have all these 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds working and they're making millions of dollars and they're simply putting in their pocket and spending it on all this new stuff. Going to dates and cars and electronics and movies and all this kind of stuff. And many marketing strategies specifically targeted these, targeted the teenagers, targeted the new older generation. We start having increased life expectancy in this time period. With life expectancy means we start having increasing numbers of elderly people. So you have new strategies targeting the old, targeting babies. This is right after the baby boom period, so we have millions of new babies born in this time period, and so we have marketing strategies targeting the parents, the brand new parents with the newborn babies. So we have all kinds of new targets, new marketing strategies for advertising. Television. Well, here we go. I've never seen research on this, but I would have to say, just off the top of my head, this has to be one of the most influential changes to American society. Actually, the entire world has to be. Can you imagine where our world would be today without television? Because television ties directly into, you say, well, I don't even watch television. I have my phone. Your phone is a television. All the streaming stuff on there, television is directly interconnected. The technologies are directly interconnected with the internet and social media. All of those things are intertwined technologies. Without one, you very well wouldn't have the others, or the others would look much different. So television is, even if you don't even watch TV, it has influenced and changed your life in ways you don't even understand, even if you don't even watch it. Television comes about in 1947. 1947, there were 7,000 TV sets. 1950, there were 7 million. 3 years, we go from a novelty, a television. What the hell is even that? A television? What even is that? To 3 years later, everybody's got to have one. It goes from most people didn't know what the hell it was to 3 years later, everybody's got one. 7 million sets, and by 1960, 98, 97% of all homes in America have a television set, at least one. So it goes from no one knows about it to there's millions out there to a few years later, by 1960, everybody's got one. It becomes the principal link between the consumer and the market, between the consumer, us, and the market, between us and the businesses. It becomes the link between us and the rest of the world. We see marketing strategies, we see advertising campaigns specifically created, storylines and commercials, all to connect us to the goods. In essence, they would have a family that would be living in their house, and they would film this as a series of commercials, and they would show them using all the modern stuff. Mom and dad are using the washer and the dryer, and the kids are playing with the new toys, and they're driving the new car, and they're using the new lawnmower and the electric dishwasher and watching television. They use the advertising and these narrative campaigns, and of course, this new thing in America, the celebrity. We often say the rise of celebrity in the US is parallels television. Yes, there are always famous people, but did people obsess about it? No, you go to the movie, hey, there's a famous person, there's Cary Grant in the movies. Okay, great. And then when you leave the movie, you forget about them. The obsession we have with celebrities really parallels television. Whether it's sports celebrities, TV celebrities, parallels the expansion of television. Paid off very well. Incredible amount of money, incredible amount of wealth generated by all this. The sales of the products rise dramatically. The expansion of our economy rises dramatically, and all this is tied together. All these new products, all this new wealth being generated, people are spending it, they're buying it. Who does it target? Primarily, all of this new technology, this television advertising, the whole consumer economy primarily targets WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. In other words, white European descent Christians. White European descent Christians. Now, we say Protestants because the majority of Americans are even in this time period, about 90% of all Americans are Protestant, regardless of skin color. Majority of Americans, the vast majority, really still are today, majority of Americans today are still Protestant, some type of Protestant faith, which has many different faiths under Protestant banner. And this is what it targets: the white, middle class, Protestant, Christian, European descent. The TV shows portrayed this as well. They portrayed the norm. You watch almost any TV show in this time period, it portrays the norm: father, mother, and a couple of kids, all white. Father knows best. Leave it to Beaver. Or the honeymooners. I like to refer to it as like Leave It to Beaverland. It portrays that way. It is that way. Um, Rarely do you see minorities in any of these shows. And if you do, what are they? Some of you might be thinking and answering right now. If you see minorities in these shows, almost always they're what? They're servants. They're service workers. They're always on the fringe. They're the minority people in the shows. By that I don't mean color. They have very small parts. They're very insignificant. The shows are almost entirely focused on the white middle class family. You know, by 1965 there was only one, like 65, 67, there was only one or two mainstream television shows that had any focus on minorities. It's hard to even think of any shows that didn't include whites, or whites as the major player or sole players in the show. San Fernando, California, right here in California. This is, I believe, a suburb of Los Angeles. So Ralph Crane took this photo, and I mean, it might be a staged photo, but it gives you the point of what again, what do people value? Think about this compared to the organization men. Another two photos to look at and discussion question: what do people value? Look at the homes. Look at what they're all getting deliveries of goods. They're getting deliveries. Back then, you got there. Well, I don't think we had disposable diapers yet. You got your diapers delivered. Oh, maybe they're disposable. I don't know. You got your diaper delivery. You got your milk delivery. You got all your goods delivered. Where are the husbands? Husbands aren't here. Look at the street for a clue. Look at the oil stains on the street for a clue. That tells you where all the husbands are. Suburb, all the houses look alike. All the women are home with their kids, their baby strollers, their little children. All the deliveries are brought to them. It would be inappropriate to have a servant if you're a middle class white in this time period. You didn't usually have servants, but what's the next step being having a servant? People deliver stuff to your doorstep. They bring it to you. Of course, you can't go into town because where's the cars? Anyway, it really talks about what people value, what matters. Stereotypical white neighborhood, white middle class suburb. Says a lot about America. Even though it's a staged photo, it still tells you what people valued. To take the time to do the photo like this, it really demonstrates what is important to the white middle class. Okay, religion and the middle class. This will be interesting. Dramatic increase in church participation after the war. About 50% to 70% of all Americans increased church participation. That's huge. I mean, that's massive. That's millions and millions of people. There's several reasons for this. Televangelism is a big part of it. The communism is a big part of it. Communists were often portrayed by the government as anti-religious, as atheists. They're not, but it was portrayed that way as atheists. And so, in essence, being American and combating communism and the Soviets, part of that became being more religious. That's one thing. That's one aspect of it. One aspect of what increased religious participation. It was a moral way of challenging communism. Televangelism, another huge part of that. You see TV, radio, televangelism across America. Advertising, massive advertising campaigns for televangelism. Eventually, we'll see television networks that are religious networks created. Preachers and ministers go on television and they have Sunday morning shows and Sunday morning services. Billy Graham was probably the first really popular televangelist in America. He used TV, radio advertising to spread his message, his evangelical Protestant message across the nation, touched millions of Americans at home um, with messages of hope and forgiveness and opportunity. Just pray with us and send us some money. Graham's message perfectly tied into consumerism in this time period. We even have a name for it. It's called religious consumerism. This idea that this is the way it goes. If you live a good life, a good moral life, a good God fearing religious life, then you deserve all the material blessings you get. In other words, if you're a good moral person, all of those things you're earning, the good job, the new house, the fridge, the cars, all the stuff you're getting is because God has blessed you with it because you're a good person, a good moral life. And since God has blessed you with it, because if God didn't want you to have all those things, God wouldn't have given it to you, right? God's omnipotent and omniscient. If God didn't want you to have a new car, a new house, you wouldn't have it. You know, all things only happen with the grace of God. So you've got all this stuff. So it's perfectly tied in. Good moral life means materialism and consumerism. God wouldn't give you the money if you weren't expected to spend it and buy things. So you've been a good person. Go buy that new car. God wants you to have. Robert Schuller in California was one of these. Robert Schuller, California, which I think was, I think that was Crystal Cathedral, which is in, where's that? Fountain Valley in Orange County. Crystal Cathedral, still there. It's not owned by them anymore. It was Robert Schuller. Then I think he died. I guess passed it on. His son took it over. I think for a while, and then they went out of business. And I'm not sure what it is now. It's probably still a religious site, but I don't believe I don't think the Schulers have it anymore. Norman Peale was another large one, another large religious televangelist. Um, they believed religion was the answer to all life's problems. Everything. Dealing with the Soviets, communism, family problems, everything. Religion was the antidote to all life's problems. All you had to do was call us, watch us, call in. We'll pray with you on the phone, pray with you on television. And for a small donation, we will make sure God watches out for you. It still happens today. I mean, it's still a real deal today. You look on Sunday morning, there's all kinds of television shows, um, all kinds of shows, religious services. Today, we have a new phenomenon in America known as the mega churches. These churches that have tens of thousands of parishioners in these non-denominational mega churches. This is still alive and well today in America, the same as it was 50 years ago. It was also the period where we get the under God and in God we trust put on our money and put in our Pledge of Allegiance. Another one of the many times I'll tell you, if anyone tells you we have separation of church and state in this country, they're lying or they're misinformed. We really don't. We don't really have a separation of church and state. They're not the same. They are certainly separate institutions, but they are heavily intertwined and working in conjunction and partnership. So don't think we really have separation of church and state in our country. We get added under God to the Pledge of Allegiance in 54, and in 56 we get in God we trust put on our money. This is primarily anti-communist propaganda. This was our wave in America of how we were combating the communists, Cold War, all the stuff from last chapter. And this is another way that it manifests. We want to make sure that when we have our Pledge of Allegiance to the United States, we make sure it's under God. It's the United States under God. And our money, in case you're unaware, the number one element of the United States government that you interact with on a regular basis more than anything else is money. Now, admittedly, today a lot of people don't carry money. The whole age of credit cards and all the kind of stuff, digital currency, whether it's on your phone or whatever. Admittedly, a lot of people don't hold cash anymore. A lot of folks don't. But just a few years ago, before this wave of e-currency and everything, and credit cards and debit cards, all this came about in the last 20 years, the whole debit cards and all that kind of stuff. Before then, everybody always had cash. And it was the number one interaction on a daily basis with the U.S. government. Everything you did had money associated with it, and that's money. It's government. And they says, "In God we trust." Ever been to court? Well, most courts on the back walls talk about God or prayer or talk about under God or things like this. Standard practice in court proceedings have been forever. It's starting to change a little bit now, but forever standard practice has been putting your hand on a Bible usually or on some type of religious book. So the idea that separation of church and state doesn't really exist, really. Why was it such a big deal regarding the communists? We had a real strong belief in this country that communists were atheists, that they didn't believe in God. Not true, but we had this belief of this. And so, in essence, a different way of combating communism and subversion in our country, again, both foreign and domestic, fighting communism, is one way is bullets, one way is with espionage, another way is with religion. We're going to prove how much better we are than communists by by moving closer to God. Communists are not atheists. They do have a lower participation in religion than we do in America. However, most people in the Soviet Union are religious, but they are, put it this way, they have separation of church and state in the Soviet Union. Their church and their state are really separate. So that is, I guess, one of the reasons we thought they were atheists, because they really didn't have God on their money, God in their courts. They didn't have God as part of their government. They didn't open up, they didn't open up, House representatives didn't open up their proceedings with prayers, that kind of stuff. So they didn't do that kind of stuff. So they had a much greater separation of church and state there, which gave the impression that they were atheists. They do have a lower church participation than the United States. We have one of the highest participation rates in the world of an industrialized country for religious services. But all this ties into communism, all this ties into the Cold War, all this ties into consumerism. Very interesting. Talk about the suburban nation, suburban America. In this time period, we have millions of people moving into areas that had once been farmland and was now being transformed into large homes, large tracts of homes, I should say. And by the 1960s, about 1/3 of all Americans lived in the suburbs. These are towns outside the major towns. These are smaller towns and communities outside the major towns and outside of major urban areas. These suburban areas. Urban areas have been around for 100 years in some capacity, but they really explode in this time period. We see thousands of them pop up across the U.S. outside of all the major urban metropolitan areas. And probably the largest reason is there's so much more money and cheap home building that it gives access to almost anyone. Almost anyone can buy a home. You know how cheap it was? There's a lot of places where you could buy a home for $100 down. No kidding, $100 down. A couple $100, $100, $400, just a couple $100, and you got yourself a brand new home. Yes, people made a lot less money back then, but even back then, a couple $100, especially if you're middle class, that was nothing. That was easy to put together. Mass-produced homes. William Levitt is one of the people that helped bring on this boom. He applied mass production technologies in the factory, mass-produced goods, to home building. On Long Island, New York is where it really starts. Long Island, New York. He then expands into New Jersey and Pennsylvania. $8,000, all inclusive. All inclusive meant everything. All appliances were included. Literally, all you needed were the people in the car, and everything else was included. That's it. 4-room basic house, mass-produced homes. They were often referred to as Levitt towns. And there were dozens of these Levitt towns. Some actually took that as their official name. Some actually called themselves Levittown. That was their real name. all named after him in this mass-produced home, which has actually become a trend in America today. There's multiple homes in America, multiple companies in America that build these mass-produced homes, like KB Homes, for instance. They build these quickly produced, mass-produced sort of cookie-cutter homes that you can build out of a catalog, and then they'll just put it together for you. Other builders did the same thing. Certainly wasn't just Levitt, but there were others did the same kind of stuff. Still expensive for the time, and they weren't particularly cheap. Still a couple $100. Well, another way that really makes it easy to get into these homes is the government makes it much, much easier to get into homes and buy new homes. FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, Veterans Administration, offer cheap mortgages, sometimes as low as 5% down. Today, the standard is 20%. They want you to put 20% down if you can on a home, 5% back then. So an $8,000 home, 5% down, what is that? $400, right? $400, brand new house, all appliances included. Literally, you just got to turn on the utilities and move in. Everything's already there. Crazy how cheap it was. And more, interest rates. 1950s interest rates were like 2%, which meant you could, it was almost no interest. I mean, 2% on $8,000 over a 20 or 30-year loan, what is that, $1,000 or something? I mean, it's just, yeah, really crazy. Almost anyone could afford a home. Unless you were abject poor, unless you were in that bottom 10, 15%, just about everyone else, including lots of people of color, lots of minorities. We do see minority suburbs popping up in some places that are primarily minority suburbs. We do see that because they often couldn't get into the white suburbs, as we'll discuss. These communities are almost always homogenous, white, middle class, young, suburban areas. Very common. Lots of young new families. This was after the baby boom, so lots of people having kids, lots of babies after the war. White, middle class, young suburbs. Lots of community regulations. Today, what do we call these? I forget what they're called. Anyway, no, not most is the wrong word. A lot of communities have rules, they have regulations on what you can do in the community. Literally, what colors you can paint things, what days of the week you have to mow your yard, what days of the week you can hang laundry out if you do that, where your car has to be parked, what type of fences, all these kind of community regulations. They become really common. Again, uniformity. That's an aspect that comes into those two pictures we looked at earlier that I said, hey, you know, what people value. One of the things people value is uniformity and conformity. Similarity and everybody falling in line and following the rules. Big part of American society in this time period, following the rules. Big part of this, uniformity and conformity. How high you can cut your lawn, stuff like this. Well, on the dark side of it, actually, that is sort of repressive and oppressive. A lot of that stuff already is. Well, on the darker side are restrictive covenants. Restrictive covenants are community policies that were specifically targeted against minorities. They kept out anyone that wasn't white, and they didn't hedge words either. They would literally say colored people not allowed, Jews not allowed, Mexicans not allowed, Chinese, Japanese not allowed. They would just have it right there on the contracts. So if you had any type of nationality that looked like one of those, they would just come around and ask you, "Are you Chinese? Do you have black in your family? Are you born in America? Are you born here? Or are you an immigrant?" Because if you answered yes to those questions, some of these communities, they'd say, well, sorry, we're not going to rent to you. And there's no law keeping them from doing it in this time period. That's the thing. Today, of course, that's illegal. That's discrimination. Back then, there was no laws. Most of the laws that come about that deal with this type of discrimination, we don't see till the 70s. So in the 40s and 50s and 60s, when all this is happening, the big boom, and all the communities are being filled up, all these neighborhoods are being filled up, all these suburbs are being built, all this affluence and wealth is going into the whites, and all these great places to live, which are safer and cleaner and nicer and newer, restricted to where if you're a minority, whether it be racially or religiously, You find it much challenging, very challenging to get in these places. Um, these are the best places to live, though. Best quality of life, lowest crime, best schools. So it isn't that they wanted to go there knowing they were going to be discriminated and prejudiced against, which many of them would have understood that would be the case. You move into a white neighborhood and you're a black family, you're going to have a challenging time. But you still wanted to do it if you could, because best schools, best opportunities, best jobs in that community, safest places to live, cleanest, newest. I mean, the list goes on. So if you could get there, you still wanted it, even with all of the negative that might literally, in some cases, border on terrorism to try and keep you out of these communities. You still, number one, of course, it was unfair, but number two, they had the best opportunities and the best places to live. So ultimately, if you're a family, you want what's best for your children and the best opportunities for them. But many of these communities simply kept them out through restrictive covenants, redlining. I'll mention redlining later, racial violence, terrorism. So even if you did get into one of these communities, they might try to chase you out. It's just a reality, the way it was. Attacks, bombings, beatings. NAACP and other legal institutions challenge many of these restrictive covenants, but it just needs to be noted that most of the stuff is still legal or semi-legal, through loopholes and stuff like that, all the way through the 70s. So for pretty much the entire 30-year period we're talking about here, they get away with it. The white communities, the white landlords, the white landowners, they were able to get away with this. Most of it doesn't change until later, much later. Well, highways and suburbs, because you have highways going all these suburbs. All these suburbs are out of town, so you got to have highways going to them. So the highways going to them increase oil consumption, triple. By the 1950s, we're using 3 times more oil in the U.S. Earl, did I just say Earl? Yeah, more Earl. I don't even know where that came from. We're using more Earl in the U.S. Of course, number of cars, millions of cars. We are the #1 producer and consumer of cars in the U.S. In the world. Sorry, #1 producer and consumer. In other words, producer and purchaser of cars in the world. How much was gas? Oh my gosh! Imagine what's gas today, like $4 or $5 a gallon, something like that. 1950s and 60s, you could get gas for as low as 10, 15 cents a gallon. I know. The most expensive gas, based upon income, was the 1970s. Yeah, most expensive gas in the last 50 years has been the 1970s, based upon actual income level at the time. If we had the same percentage of gas today, gas prices today, as compared to the 1970 income levels, gas today would be almost $15 a gallon. Yeah, if it was based on income, the same way it was in this, comparable to the 1970s, gas would be almost $15 a gallon today. You want to know how to go to a green economy? Make gas $15 a gallon. Everybody be like, give me a damn what's it called? Hybrid. Give me a damn hybrid car, man. I don't want. I mean, that's. But then that's one of the biggest arguments made today by green energy. Energy is the only way we're ever going to get people to convert over, really fully convert over, is if we just jack the price of oil up so high, which of course never going to happen, because oil is a $1 trillion business that enriches so many people. They're never going to do anything to endanger that. So anyway, the point being, gas is cheap today. Gas, compared to incomes, gas is really cheap. Back then it was cheap too, 15 cents a gallon. I mean, even when I was growing up, when I was a teenager, I could buy gas for $1. I remember buying gas for $1 a gallon. Oil consumption, vehicle purchases skyrocket. And of course, if we have more cars in suburbs, we must have highways to go with it. We must have highways all across the U.S. U.S. government gets in on this for a couple of reasons. The National Interstate Defense Highways Act of 1956. National Interstate Defense Highways Act of 56. I'm going to put myself right up here. I'm still blocking a couple of words there, letters, but all right, you can deal with it. Look at the name. It really tells you. National Interstate Defense Highways Act. Think for a moment. Why do we build all these massive? This is the interstate system. The I-10, I-20, I-30, I-15, all that kind of stuff. This is the interstate system. Why do we build the international, I don't know why I said that, the national interstate system across the US? It was actually approved through Congress as a defense bill for two reasons. One, transport of military goods and products and weapons quickly across America in case of an invasion. And we really truly believed that the Soviets or the Chinese could invade us. So we needed to be able to move troops, supplies, and weaponry from coast to coast as quickly as possible. So that's why we needed these big 4 and 6 lane highways. Secondly, when the sirens go off and you know the bombs are coming, and back then every single town had a bomb warning, a bomb siren. Every town or community had a siren which was loud enough to be heard over the whole community. Was a bomb warning system to let you know the bombs were coming. It was allowed for ease of evacuation from the cities. These large multi-lane highways are supposed to allow quick and efficient evacuation of the cities. Now, in the 1950s, that might have been possible. When we started building this again in the 50s, it lasted about 10 years, and it cost $26 billion, which back then was a massive amount of money. In 1950s, we could have probably evacuated most large, maybe not New York, but most large cities in America, we could have probably evacuated in a few hours when it's like 6, 8 lanes across. Not today. You know how long it would take to evacuate Los Angeles in an emergency? Probably days. It would take days to probably do that. Yeah. But anyway, the point is, at the time, this was the national defense thing. Ultimately, of course, becomes our interstate highway system, which is incredibly significant and incredibly important for transport of goods and people across the U.S. Still today, the majority of goods in the U.S. are still transported via truck. A truck and train. Truck and train's a big part of it too. Anyway, at the time, it was the largest construction project in American history. We never built anything like this. I mean, look at it. Our interstate highway system, coast to coast, north, south, east, west, is massive. Massive construction project. Employed millions of people. Good paying union construction jobs. Yeah. Still today, honestly, if you can handle the challenges of construction, it's one of the best paying jobs in America. It really is. And it also very often unionized. Even today, it's one of the industries that is still primarily unionized in the United States, construction industry. Good paying jobs, always work. You don't need advanced college degrees. There's only a handful of things in the U.S. you can do. Of course, entrepreneur is always an option. You can always be a self-made person. But as far as actual paid jobs, there's only a handful of jobs in the U.S. today that you can really make a good income without any type of college education. And construction is one of those. Get started at a young age, and by the time you're in your 20s, you could be making 20, $30 an hour in middle class. Um, is one of those aspects of American industry that has always really prospered well, and it is still often unionized. And these are the people working on this. Lots of construction projects employed millions, and it was also a way to the middle class for lots of people. Lots of drawbacks, of course. Um, Ultimately advantageous for the society as a whole, but lots of drawbacks. Small town America starts to fade away. As the interstates, it's no longer about Main Street and small town America. It is now about the freeways and off ramps and interchanges and all the suburbs and all the shopping centers which pop up off these suburbs and stuff. Another real interesting problem is on the edges of lots of towns and communities, especially large urban areas, they would tear down poor housing. They would tear down minority housing and poor neighborhoods to build the freeways and the big exchanges. And they were often able to get away with this legally through the oh my gosh, it was totally in my head and it's blanked. Um, there's a legal procedure which I can't remember. Eminent domain, there it is, where the government can come in and say, for the good of the community, we have eminent domain over this territory, and we can force you to leave or move. As long as we compensate you in some way fairly, we can force you to move out, and we're going to literally demolish everything and build a freeway interchange. Often happen because they're not going to demolish a brand new white suburb. They're not going to demolish expensive condominiums where wealthy people live, but they're going to demolish poor older housing to make ways on the edge of cities for lots of this stuff. Certainly disadvantageous to a lot of those people, very detrimental to the poor and minorities. And you say, well, they have to compensate them equally or fairly, right? They do. The landowners, they don't have to do any compensation for the renters. All the renters get is a notice on their door that says in 60 days they have to move. The landowner is going to get compensated. The building owner is going to get compensated well for being forced to sell his rental building, but you're not going to get anything other than kicked out on the street. Fast food shopping malls expand. I mean, this really changes America. This changes the entire structure of the United States. From small town America to the suburb, from mom and pop stores to one-stop shopping. Um, all kinds of inventions. Shopping malls and fast food really changes America. And those are just really exemplifying how everything becomes quick, fast, in and out. It's all about getting the services as quickly as possible to get on with our lives. It isn't about socializing. I mean, the center of American culture for most of our history has been small town America. Even when the big cities occurred, every city still often focused on a small town vibe in individual neighborhoods. So even in large industrial or urban areas like New York, most people still lived and worked and shopped in their own little neighborhood communities. So even in a place like New York, it was like a collection of 100 small towns inside one larger economic center. But still, everyone generally dealt with the people locally. This changes everything. Now people are moving out of the cities. The cities become industrial complexes, while anyone who can moves outside the city into the suburbs. And now it's all about getting what you need as you're transiting from your work to your home and your home to your work. Stopping and doing whatever shopping you need at the mall where there's thousands of people, fast food drive-throughs, you don't even get out of your car and talk to anybody. We really moved away from social interactions. We become the most prosperous people in the world, and the most prosperous people in the U.S. are the ones living in the suburbs, enjoying all of this, enjoying all this prosperity and all of this advantage. Here we go. Highways in 1930. Whoa, look at that. Northeast, industrial Northeast. That's it. Really, I mean, other than the industrialization of the West Coast between Oregon and Washington down to San Francisco and Los Angeles, and then the West Coast. There's people living all through here, but it's all rural farming communities. Now, 1970, look at that. That is the National Interstate Defense Highways Act right there. Began in 56, and by 1970, it's pretty much finished, and we have built an interconnecting system of interstate highways across the United States, paid for by the government, worked on by us, the millions of workers, for the purposes of national defense and the growth of our suburbs. It's really pretty impressive. And it's good overall for the majority of Americans, even considering this, how terrible it was for poor neighborhoods and minorities. For the majority of American population, this is good. The highway system helps America expand and grow. It really takes Midwest America, which is almost entirely backwards rural farming communities. It modernizes them, gives them new technologies, because usually where these highways go, the train lines may already be there. Sorry, let's not say train lines. I meant to say electric lines, phone lines, modern services, social services, modern water systems, all this stuff follows. The modernization of America sweeps across America. The Northeast had already been, and the West Coast had been to some degree, but most of the Midwest America was not, and this brings that with them. It brings modern technology to the majority of Americans, for good or for bad. There's probably some people that would argue the computers are terrible, but that's the way it is. It's not like we're going to go back. We're certainly not going backwards. So the rise of the Sun Belt. Majority of your suburbs are in the Sun Belt. Where's the Sun Belt? This region from Southern California all the way across the U.S. over to Florida and Virginia. This entire region right here. This is the Sun Belt. From California to Florida, and of course, the biggest states that are most influenced by the Sun Belt and the growth of Sun Belt suburbs are Florida, California, and Texas. Why the Sun Belt? Why did the majority of Americans move into or migrate to the Sun Belt in this 20-year period? When we see migrations, I'm not saying a majority of people live there. I'm saying the majority of internal movements in the United States, domestic migration, and migration into the U.S., international migration, the majority of that is into the Sun Belt. Why? Great reasons. Low or no taxes. Most Sun Belt states have low or almost no taxes. Property taxes, sales taxes, again, income tax, that's a federal thing. As far as states go, and property taxes, all kinds of taxes. Either low or zero taxes. Why? Because they want people to move there. They have pretty much almost no taxes to entice people to move there. Climate. If any of you have ever lived up in the Northeast, sometimes it gets quite shitty. I used to live in the Northeast, ice and snow and cold and freezing temperatures and dangerous roads. I mean, I like the snow as much as anyone, but the snow is great when you can see it and then drive down the mountain and get away from it and get out of it. Living in the snow for days, weeks, months, living in blizzards, all this kind of stuff. Anyway, so the temperate climate of the Sun Belt. And of course, open lands. The majority of the Sun Belt was empty. Lots and lots of lands, which also implies, because there was a large amount of open land, that also means the prices are low. Because they want to entice people to buy the land. And there's so much available, the huge supply, whenever there's a big supply, that means the price goes down. Because there's a massive supply of open land. Texas, Florida, and California had about as much open land as most of the other states combined. So lots of opportunity for people to come and move for taxes, climate, open lands, all kinds of stuff. Well, let's specifically talk about California. California, a big part of California which brought people here, in addition to taxes, climate, open lands, which California had all those, also jobs. This really applies to all the Sunbelt areas, specifically Texas, Florida, California. Massive amount of jobs in defense works. The majority of all defense industry in the United States was in these three states by the 1970s. Majority of defense industry in the U.S., again, the majority of it, over 50%, is just in these three states. Incredible amount of jobs. Aerospace, electronics industry, I would think like we have here in California, the Silicon Valley. Think NASA, which happens in Texas and Florida, and all the aerospace industry, all the plane industry. The 1960s and 70s is when the plane industry just takes off. That's when the plane industry takes off in our society, becomes huge. Defense and military bases. Half of all military bases in the U.S. was in these three states. So you've got military bases, and then population-wise. By 1970, 10% of the entire population lived in California. 10% of the entire U.S. population lived in that one state. And by the way, by 1980, California was the 10th largest economy in the world. In the world. Just the state of California. 10th largest economy in the entire world. Just one state. People come here for jobs, opportunity, economic opportunities. Population explodes. We see populations going in the millions and the tens of millions. The cities and towns and counties all expand due to military bases and military facilities. The actual military facilities and then all the military industrial complex that goes with it to give them all their supplies and weapons and materials. Houston or San Diego or Los Angeles or Orange County. It's just really crazy. These become the three largest booming places in the U.S. are these three states, and generally a Sunbelt altogether. Not just these three states, these are the three big ones, but across the entire Sunbelt, across the entire southern U.S. We see massive expansion of military, industrial complex, populations. The majority of all suburbs open up in the Sunbelt region. Specifically, a great Sunbelt suburb is the Orange County. The entire OC. Not just one town, but pretty much the entirety of Orange County was a suburb of Los Angeles and Long Beach. Really, the whole county was. Orange County, California. New facilities built for the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines. From aircraft hangars to airports to military bases to ordnance facilities, banking bombs to naval facilities to hospitals. It's just the list just goes on and on and on. And to go with this, you have millions of people working in this military industrial complex where they need entertainment, relaxation, they need stores to shop at, they need places to buy services, they need to go buy cars, they need everything. Uh, Disneyland is built as a result of this. Disneyland is built in the 50s as a result of this. It was created as an entertainment hub for all of the massive population boom in Orange County, which was primarily military and people associated with military industrial complex. Population of Orange County is a great example. 1940, it had 130,000 people. 1960, it had just under a million. It's like a 5 or 6 time increase in population in 20 years. Primarily focused on military industrial complex and all of the support services that go with it. For every family dealing with the complex or working in a complex, you got to have all the housing, the gas stations, the grocery stores, the movie theaters, all of the other services that go along with it. Pretty crazy. This was, in essence, the West Coast version of Coney Island, if you will. Disneyland. Pretty amazing. Massive immigration, huge population boom. This gives you an idea of the Sunbelt suburbs, or the Sunbelt in general. Los Angeles over to Florida. You see the biggest population boom is the dark blue. Nevada here, this is Arizona, right? Nevada, Arizona, or is it New Mexico? That's New Mexico, it's Arizona, right? So Nevada, Arizona, Alaska. What's Alaska? They went from like 12 to 24. That's a huge boom, right? I like to poke fun at Alaska because, it's just really cold up there. So look at the big increase. The red to the black indicates the size of the increase. So you have this massive black line here. So a huge increase in population. But look at the Northeast. Every place is increasing in population. But look at how thin the black line is at New York. Population is increasing very incrementally in all these northeastern cities. This had been, for all of American history, the heart of the United States. From the Great Lakes over to New York had been the center of industry and economic power in the U.S. Now it is transferred to the Sun Belt, from Florida over to California. Growth of Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, Tampa, Miami, Los Angeles, San Francisco. You notice on this map, what is the one single state that has a loss? That's it, one place. West Virginia. West Virginia is the one place that has an actual population loss. Oh, you can't see that on the chart. There it is. You can see that orange area means it's a loss. And currently today, it is still the lowest socioeconomic level in the United States today. The 50 states is still West Virginia. It is still considered to be one of the most rural states of the lower 48. Because you go to Alaska, Alaska is primarily rural. But the lower 48, it is thought to be still one of the most rural states with lowest socioeconomic level in the U.S. But everywhere else is a population increase, except for that one state. Very interesting. And I guess this would be Hawaii right here. Yeah. Hawaii is a state now, yeah. Hawaii became a state, what, 1950? Hawaii became a state as a result of the Cold War. I'm not going to get into that right now, but the Cold War is the reason we got Hawaii as a state. All right. 2 nations, one urban, one suburban, one white, one black. We start with this urban crisis. This urban crisis, which does make America 2 different nations, one white, one black, certainly unequal societies. This crisis has 3 parts: poverty, housing, and segregation. So in the 1950s, we see a drastic shift in population. where the largest cities in America lose millions of whites but gain more millions of non-white. In essence, whites out, blacks in. You also may have heard the term white flight. That's what it is. It's whites fleeing the cities, going to the suburbs, and we see much larger increase in minority populations in the cities. As a result, poverty intensifies dramatically. The better paying jobs leave the cities. They go to the white suburbs. They go to the white middle class, increasing education levels of white versus black. All equals increasing prosperity and affluence for whites. And even though there is increasing prosperity for blacks, technically, it's marginal compared to dramatic for white populations. Everybody generally increases during this time period. All populations have an increase, generally speaking. But the increase is incremental, marginal, maybe is a better word, for minorities, people of color, much larger for whites. These had always been the worst areas to live. All the slums of New York, the slums in Chicago, these have always been the worst places to live. But they'd had a little more equal representation of race. Now you find these places primarily occupied by Latino and black minorities. Immigrants and minorities become the primary workers in America's urban cities by the 1960s, 70s. Majority of workers in America's urban inner city areas are minority workers. Non-white, fewer job opportunities. Largest cities in Northeast often had this industrialization become very common. We see increased industrialization and factory mechanization, which also means there's fewer jobs available because machines are doing so much of the work. And the jobs that are available, they're often service jobs. They're talking about outside the factory, service jobs, janitorial jobs, service industry in general. Another problem is if you do want to work in these new mechanized factories with a much smaller actual worker population, requires higher levels of education to deal with the new electronics, the computers, the new technology. Which means you have a factory now which used to employ 100 minority workers, now only needs 20 workers due to the mechanization, industrialization of the factory, the assembly lines, all the automated machines. So 80 people are out of work now, and the 20 that are left now require higher education. They require special jobs training, which is sometimes out of reach for minority workers, either because of opportunity or money. Fewer jobs available. Often the housing that exists is bad. Poor housing. It was still common in this period in the 1960s to have housing that dated back to the turn of the century in many of the northeastern cities. New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, places like this still had lots of turn of the century housing, which was out of date, poor, inadequate housing, poor quality housing. All these older neighborhoods. Lots of restrictions on home ownership. If there were homes to be inside the cities, it was tougher to get them due to restrictive covenants, redlining, things like this. Well, one of the answers to this was urban renewal. Today, you might have heard the term gentrification. It's similar. They're not exactly the same, but there's a lot of similarities. In other words, get rid of the old stuff, tear down the old stuff, redo it, rebuild it, make it new, modernize it, bring it into the modern age. Here's the problem. You have poor people living in old housing. The reason they live in that old housing is because that's the only place they could find jobs, and it's the only place they can afford. Because it is older, outdated, poor services, therefore it's cheaper. They kick them out, demolish the building, rebuild a brand new building. Hey, come move back in. But they can't. So their neighborhood is now gone because the housing is now 4 times more expensive. Plus, they've got restrictive covenants and redlining, which means even if a black family could afford to move into the housing, they happen to be in the middle class, have a better job, work in a factory with a union job. Guess what? They're going to say, sorry, we don't rent to black people. Bye. End of story. So they would revitalize these old neighborhoods, these urban renewal projects. It was terrible. This was one of the ways to try and keep the white people in the cities. Because it's not like every white person moves out, of course. We have millions move out, but there's still millions of white people in the cities. So one of the ways they try to get them to stay and not go to the suburbs is to build the new housing in the cities. New apartment complexes, new condominium buildings, fancy, new, with all the new appliances, new technology. However, they have to tear down the old building, which housed black minorities and poor, and now they built a brand new building that they're not allowing blacks. The black people live in those communities often can't afford to live there anyway, and they bring in white people and they start revitalizing and renewing the entire neighborhood, making life even worse for minorities in this new housing. They often couldn't afford them and they had to relocate elsewhere. These urban renewal projects were also, they did other things. They would demolish older parts of cities and build parks, homes, shopping centers, freeways, mostly in areas that minorities had lived and rented in. Because they were poor areas, they could afford to live there because they had poor paying jobs. Yeah. Well, where do they go? Well, the U.S. government finally steps in and has a solution, although it's a very poor solution, and it turns out to be, how's the saying go? The cure is as bad as the sickness, or something like that. That's not exactly how it goes, but you understand what I'm saying. The cure for the disease is maybe worse than the disease itself. The cure is the projects. If anyone's familiar with these, bad. The solution was to relocate them to what we call federal housing projects. These were cheap communities, often isolated on the edge of towns and communities, literally sometimes walled in. They would build big walls around them. They would claim it was for security reasons, for security purposes, to protect the residents. Maybe that factored into it because they were often gated as well. But oftentimes it's also thought they were blocked like that with walls to hide them, to where people literally couldn't see them. You've heard of out of sight, out of mind. Exactly how it applies here. To where people going by didn't have to see inside the projects. The projects quickly become the worst places to live in the United States. They have the worst services, social services, utility services, the highest levels of crime. They have the worst schools, the highest poverty schools, the least serviced and repaired, maintained schools. Poorest trained teachers because nobody wants to work in these schools because they're simply bad areas. So some of these schools were known to have rates of over 20% of under, I don't know what the term is we use, I don't have my notes, but some of these schools were known to have over 20% of the teachers that were untrained or uncertified. Some in Chicago, downtown Chicago, had almost 50%. 50% because they couldn't get trained teachers to go there. They simply couldn't hire them. They wouldn't work there. So the worst services, the worst education. These were almost entirely minority neighborhoods and housing projects, often policed by whites. These became centers of crime and poverty. A great example is Robert Taylor Homes in Chicago, which their expose was done on this back in, what was it, the 70s? I don't have it in my notes either. I remember reading about it a couple years ago. Some news magazine, I don't know, Time or Life or something, or I don't know what it was, did an expose on the projects, and they claimed it was the worst place to live in America. The statistics would certainly bear out that it was a bad place to live. It was a 28 building, 16-story projects that housed 20,000 people, almost all black and almost all living under the poverty line. So you tear down all the neighborhoods in the cities where the poor people live, the only places they can afford, and have their families. You build these new places that only middle class and above people can afford, primarily white. And then you force all the minority people into these housing projects, which are really, really terrible places. Um, this creates a long-standing system, institutionalized system of racism and segregation and discrimination. Because one of the ways people get ahead in America or anywhere is you pass it to the next generation. You pass on wealth to the next generation, wealth generation. You pass on opportunities to the next generation by getting your kids going to school and getting an education. And the ideal is every single generation gets more and more prosperous. Your kids have it better than you, and their kids have it better than they did. That's the goal. The problem is when you have put people in this situation, you cut out one of those levels. So you have an entire generation to where the parents cannot make the kids' lives better. The kids' lives are the same or even worse than the parents were. And you actually, instead of seeing this increasing spread of wealth and prosperity, it's actually a reverse. You actually see a diminishing amount of wealth and prosperity for minorities, which is then passed on generation to generation, often focusing on blacks in this time period. Um, this is long-standing institutionalized racism and prejudice and segregation, discrimination in the United States. It is institutionalized. This is the government doing this. Now, some people in the government believe this was the answer, and admittedly, when they designed it, I would imagine some did not plan it being like this. Their solution was cheap public housing for people who can't afford to live in these communities anymore that have torn down the old housing, whether it's to build parks, roads, new housing projects, whatever, for the middle class. So I don't know if they ever envisioned it being like this, but that is ultimately irrelevant because this is what it becomes. From New York to Los Angeles and 100 places in between, all across America. Well, let's shift gears to the baby boom. Post-war America was dominated by an idea of female domesticity, often associated with increased pregnancies and childbirth and much bigger families, and the nuclear family of 4 to 5 kids, or 4 to 5 people, husband, wife, and 2 to 3 kids. This is popularized in books, TV, politics, media, religion, everything. Popularizes this idea. Okay, well, how's all this come about? Really, what creates it? Well, the boom, the baby boom. Makes me think of that movie. Here comes the boom. Yeah, okay. Should look it up. Google it. It's a funny movie. So after the war, marriages were stable. Few divorces. Not a lot of people got divorced. You didn't want to get divorced because divorce was seen as a failure. And especially in like suburbs, everybody knows everybody in these little suburbs. So yeah, it's a failure if you get a divorce. You failed. You screwed up the American dream or something. Yeah. So this nuclear family becomes dominant. We see more babies born between 48 and 53 than in the previous 30 years. Between 48 and 53, more children born than in the previous 30 years. So just to keep it simple, that's a 6-time increase. So a 6-time increase in births. And of course, it's because of the war. The war and the depression of the 30s and 40s kept people from having families and starting families. Either because the men were dying or the depression. You don't want to start a family when you can't even feed the family you have. Well, due to the increased influence and the final reduce of anxiety that occurs when the war finally ends, because you got to consider for 20 years, America was just a stressful place to be. Between the depression from 29 until 47, you're talking about almost 20 years of constant stress and anxiety, depression, war. In essence, hey, let's relax and have sex. Let's be happy we're still alive. We survived. Lots of that. In addition, longer life expectancy means you live longer, you have more children. Pardon me, you have average family having 3 kids. The boom remained high into the 60s. Larger life expectancy often having to do with miracle drugs. Penicillin was created in this time period, which was the cure for many illnesses. You simply went to the doctor and got a shot in your butt. Penicillin. Bend over and ow! And there you go. Cures most illnesses. So you have miracle drugs. You have cure for polio, for instance, in this time period. Polio, which killed or crippled millions of children, just in the United States, over the last couple hundred years. It was really bad. It was a deadly disease. These new drugs change the way people deal with illness and quality of life. We have this improved medicine, and we have a new thing focusing, which is a brand new term we had never used before, preventative medicine. Today, anytime you hear anyone talk about medicine, they talk about preventative medicine. The goal today is to prevent you from getting sick, whether it be through vaccines or regular checkups or examinations, whatever. The idea is to find it before it gets you. Well, back then, previous to this time period, that wasn't a deal. Before the 1960s, you did not go to the doctor until you were sick for anything. Vaccines weren't a big vaccines had existed, but vaccines were not pretty much mandated across the US. The reality was before the 60s, you didn't see a doc until you needed a doc. By the 60s, they start talking about, well, you go to the doctor before you need a doctor. So you don't ever really have to need the doctor. Preventative medicine, which becomes the way of our medicine going forward. Um, so, yeah, the vaccines, the drugs, the miracle drugs, preventative medicine, all this kind of stuff. It really changes and increases life expectancy dramatically. From the early 1900s to the 1980s, life expectancy increases by 20 years. Yeah. So in just a couple of generations, you are going to live on average 20 years longer than, say, your great grandparents. Big difference. Ironically enough, it's actually going the other way today. If you're not aware, life expectancy is actually dropping the last couple of years. It's really very small, like a tenth of a year each year or something, but it's going down. Years ago, they used to think life expectancy just keep going up. They thought by the 21st century, everybody be living to 100 because it increased so dramatically during the 20th century. Well, somewhere around the 1980s, it just leveled off. Somewhere around the 80s, our life expectancy pretty much flatlined. It's slightly increased from then on, but really mildly, and then now it's actually started to go down again. The number one reason in the U.S. they believe that is obesity. It's really odd how much of a health conscious nation we are, and yet we have the highest rates of obesity in the world. Yeah, WTF. Really seems like an oxymoron. Seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Nonetheless, we are actually starting to go the other way now. This idea that our great grandparents or grandparents thought that we'd all be living to 100 or 120 by now. Nope, not happening. Also, greater emphasis on education. Universities expand. High value placed on education. By the 1960s, the majority of all American families have at least one college-educated parent. Majority of all American families have at least one college-educated adult in the house by the 1960s. Expenditures in education's double, universities expand. I've already sort of covered that, but this is another part of that. I covered universities expanding I've covered it for two reasons. So far, I've covered it because the military-industrial complex, the space and arms race. I've covered the universities and colleges expanding as a result of the millions of veterans joining. Also, the universities expand as a result of the baby boom. By the 1960s, for all these reasons, universities and colleges double their number of seats in the U.S. By the 1960s over the 1940s, there are double as many seats in colleges and universities in the United States, meaning bigger rooms, more classrooms, more campuses, more schools, etc., twice as many college students. Baby boom is part of that, of course. The universities have to expand to deal with it. Here we go, your declining birth rates from 1860. Look at this. From 1860, birth rates constantly decline. The reason for this is what? Think about it for a moment. There's maybe not enough here for a discussion question, but think about that. Why? Obviously, there's an obvious reason, right? We already talked about it. And of course, the reason is the cities, urban areas. All the people have moved to the cities. Oh, that's an exaggeration, of course, all the people. But millions and millions of people move to the cities where you don't need 5, 6, 7 kids to work on the farm. 1860, almost all of America was rural. 1960, the majority of America is urban. By the 1960s, the majority of Americans, 6 out of 10 Americans, live in an urban environment, urban, suburban, which are both ties. So urban, suburban, which that's not rural. Neither one of those are considered rural. So urban, suburban is where the majority of Americans live. You don't need all those kids. You need all the kids on the farm. You don't need all the kids in the city. They're simply a liability. You want to focus your resources on 2 or 3 children to give them the best opportunities. So birth rates continue to decline. And of course, here the decline is dramatic. Depression, World War II. Then the war ends and boom, right there, baby boom. A huge baby boom period to receive a massive increase in pregnancies and birth rates. Dramatic. Going all the way back to levels of 1920, which is interesting because that was right after World War I. So right off to the levels of 1920. We also see an increase there. It's not an increase, right? It continues going down. If you actually look at over year change, it is actually an increase over the previous years. Because look here, during the war, it goes straight down, and then it starts to level off. It's still decreasing birth rate, but that actually means because it starts to level off, it's actually a decreasing birth rate, a decreasing birth rate, if you will. Doesn't matter. You don't need to worry about World War One. But anyway, it gives you the idea of how after World War One, we also see something sort of similar. There is an association here between 1 and 2, where you can see the actual birth rate, while it's still dropping, it starts to almost level off for a while as more people, you know, World War One certainly hit America a lot less dramatically than World War II. World War One had a much smaller impact. We were in the war literally for a few months. We came in 1918 and were there a few months and the war ended. So our major impact on the U.S. World War One was significantly less than World War II. And then birth rates continue to decline, and then the 1970s and 80s actually start to pick up a little bit. Interesting. All right, our last topic: women, work, and family. 2 things were very dramatic, and they shaped the female relationship to work and family in this period. The feminine mystique is one, and then the second one is the job market. I'm going to talk about both. But these 2 things really dramatically affect the way women deal with and interact with family and work and relationships, is the job market and the feminine mystique. Let's start with the first one. The feminine mystique. This was a feminist, Betty Friedan's critique of the middle-class domestic ideal. Betty Friedan, who wrote, and this was originally I think it was like an article that eventually becomes like a book, this critique of femininity in America. And to be clear, from the beginning, she's not critiquing women exactly. She's really critiquing society's representation of women. It's maybe a way to look at it. So it's the ideal of the middle-class domestic housewife. And the 2 problems are, 1, she says it's bullshit. It isn't real. And 2, let me say that differently. It's not entirely real. It's real for some women, but for millions of women, it isn't real. And number 2, that the psyche of it, the psychology of it, should not exist. That, first of all, it isn't real, and that it is discriminatory and prejudicial towards women. The whole ideal of this feminine housewife mystique, this ideal image of the woman. She argues that, quote, the highest value and the only commitment for women is the full fulfillment of their own femininity. She argues this. In essence, the most important thing for a woman is to fulfill her own needs and her own femininity, to deal with her own needs and, well, femininity is the word. Psychologists often argued that a woman's role in the 1950s and 60s was as a mother and a housewife. And this was as what psychologists would argue, this would have been the highest fulfillment of a woman's femininity would have been as a mother and a wife. It's external. Psychologists would argue that a woman's needs and wants and psychological needs should be externalized, having to do with the family and the kids and the husband and the home. Frieden argues, the way I understand it anyway, is she argues the reverse of that. The actual highest ideal for a woman should be internalized to satisfy herself. And this is not like this isn't about being selfish. This isn't about ignoring the needs of your family and things, but it's about reordering the rank. The common ideal that is seen in American society with media, politics, the news, the movies, everything indicates that a woman's highest goal was about being the housewife and the mother, taking care of the family. That is where a woman should be. Betty Friedan argues, one, millions of women can't do that, don't do that. Millions of women work all the time, have 2 jobs, they support the family. Whether they're single mothers or a wife, they are right out there doing the work and they're not being appreciated for it or given equal treatment for it. And then she argues that you need to reprioritize it. Instead of having the ultimate ideal being external, the family and everything, it should actually be flipped. A woman should put her priorities up at the top. That does not discount other priorities. That doesn't mean you stop caring about your husband or your family or your home or your kids, but you have to put your needs first and take care of yourself first, and then worry about other things. Most psychologists said a normal mother was, this housewife, this mother. Further, psychologists would argue if you didn't agree with this, or you didn't like this, or you thought it was wrong, or for some reason you did not buy into it, there might be something wrong with you. They would argue that you might need to get treated. Maybe you need to have counseling or go to a psychiatrist. For instance, if you don't want to be married. For instance, if you're gay. For instance, if you want to get an education, have a career. Well, there might be something wrong with you. This is what was argued by, this was mainstream at the time. Betty Friedan was an outlier. The idea of the mainstream of a woman was exactly this, the suburban housewife ideal image. Everything portrayed that. And if a woman ever stepped outside that, there was an argument made by the mainstream world, this is both religious and secular, that there might be something wrong with you. Maybe you need to go seek treatment. You want to have a job and a career, and you don't want to have kids, and you want to be single, and you want to work in a man's world. I don't know about you. There might be something wrong. Maybe you need to get treated. This was real. This has happened all the time. And that's another aspect of Friedan's argument. This was psychologically detrimental to women. It hurt them because women were being taught by society that it was wrong to want to be independent or free-minded or to think equally or think about equality or think about simply not being the suburban housewife. You were being taught by society that you shouldn't do that. There's something wrong with you, which is psychologically damaging. And this paradox really is this, that women are being told this is their place, to be the family domestic. And yet the reality is 2 things. 1, a lot of women don't want to do that. And 2, millions of women do work. Millions of women work outside the home, either because they're single or because you simply cannot live this idealistic consumer life in America without 2 incomes. A lot of people, the way to the middle class, required a second income. You want all that luxury stuff. You want that extra car, that second car. You want the TV in every room. You want your kids to all have separate bedrooms. You want that pool in the backyard. You know what? The husband, even with his good job, simply doesn't make enough money. Therefore, the wife has to go out and work. Millions of women in the middle class worked. But there's even another aspect to it. If they did work, they weren't treated as equal contributors. They often weren't treated that way. They were treated as, oh, we really don't need your income. It's just, a little extra money on the side. Hey, it helps out a little bit. Or, but, I'm really the breadwinner, the guy. It's all about the guy. And so even if a woman worked, it would often be kept secret too. The husband didn't want his friends to know that his wife had to work to help them. And if she did work and found out, she just does it for fun, for a hobby, just to buy, just because she has time to kill or she's bored or something. They would often play it off because the cultural phenomenon was the man taking care of the family. End of story. There really wasn't a but. There wasn't an and, an if, or an or. It was simply boom, done. The man provides for the family, done. And if the wife had to help provide for the family, which millions of women did, that would have been, to many men's eyes, it would have been insulting or belittling, which makes it even worse for women. They're out there contributing, and yet they can't really take credit for it, which is psychologically, it's belittling, it's insulting. This world of the 1950s and 60s, this urban middle class America, this suburban middle class America, it's almost like it's gilded. We talked about the Gilded Age years ago. It's almost sort of like that. From the distance, it looks perfect. Leave it to Beaver, Father Knows Best. Looks perfect. When you actually look at it closely, you realize it's very fractured. Women, and the second part of this is the job market, which I've sort of already touched on. Women often work double duty. Double duty is where you have a job out in the public, and then you come home and you have your home job. It was very common for women to do this, to have two jobs. One out in the public where they got paid, they had a boss, they sat in a desk, whatever it was, and then they came home and still had to do the home job. They had to cook, clean, take care of the kids, do the laundry, wash the dishes, etc. In addition to a day job. While the husband would come home at night after his 5 or 6 o'clock, get off the train, come back home, honey, give me a beer, kick his shoes off, put his feet up, and watch the news. So she would come home from working all day and then have to work all night. And this, again, is a psychological issue because they often weren't given credit for that work at home. And yet the reality is we know that women's work at home is just as much work. It's just as much psychologically, just as much physically tiring, and they don't get credit for it. They don't get a paycheck. They don't get benefits. They don't get days off. There's no holidays from taking care of the kids. That's what summer camp's for. Yeah, it's this double duty was so common for women. To maintain the consumer class lifestyle really required it. And then what work did women do? Women's work is what most women did, and that's even another problem. Being a clerk, a cook, a secretary, healthcare technician, a waitress, a stewardess, domestic servant, receptionist, telephone operators. Most of the women that did this work did, as I sort of already mentioned, it's often work that is part-time, lower pay, often ununion, so no union, so less benefits. They don't get credit for it. They get a paycheck, but they don't get credit for helping the family. And look at a few comparable industries, for instance. Let's look at the health industry. 97% of all doctors are women. About the same percentage. I said it wrong, didn't I? 90% of all women were nurses, and about 97% of all men in the health industry. I'm still saying it wrong. If you're damn it, why is that so hard to say? Almost all nurses are women and almost all doctors are men. There you go. Screw it. Forget the percentages. Almost all nurses are women and all doctors are men. Let's look at the law profession. Almost all lawyers are men and almost all paralegals or secretaries are women. So the lawyers are the men and then the assistants are the women. The doctors are men and the assistants, the nurses, are women. So women's work still across the board in many cases. Also pay. 1963, the pay disparity was 60%. In 1963, a woman doing the same job as a man, and of course, there's certainly jobs that are done by both men and women. A woman made 60%, 60 cents on the dollar for every man. Today, the pay disparity still exists. Today, depending on what statistics you read and who puts it out, the most current numbers that I've read, looking at all the different statistics, are between 85 and 93. So between 85 and 93%, meaning a woman at doing the same exact job as a man makes between 83 and 93% of what a man makes. This is for normal jobs. This is not including executive level jobs. Executive level jobs, like the really high pay jobs in America, it's about 50%. Women make about 50% of what a man makes in really that top 1% of jobs, the big money jobs. So on a standard job, you're looking at 80, 85, 90% of what a man makes. So even today in a modern society, even today, women still do the same exact work as a man and get paid less. We also know it's also harder to get promoted. We believe statistics show women get promoted about 70% as often as men. Bottom line is the American middle class, the American white middle class, and really honestly, this statistics here applies to all. This really isn't about just white. Yes, the majority of Americans are white, but these statistics we see here really apply to all people, regardless of race or whatnot. The bottom line is the doorway to the American middle class was a lot trickier to get through that door than is portrayed by popular media and politics. And it was a lot messier. It was a lot harder to get there. And it was not nearly as simple as they made it look in the movies. Women were necessary contributors in every way, whether it is in the public or in the private, even though they often did not get credit for it. I believe that's it. Thanks for bearing with me and getting through it all, and I appreciate it. And we will see you next time.